Get that mutt out! The Alpha King shouted across the stone courtyard so hard that half the nobles flinched, and the laughter that followed was the kind designed to remind you that you are a piece of thrash. You don't belong here and never will. Leora froze at the edge of the circle, her fingers tightening around the worn leather strap tied gently around the neck of the small creature beside her. Ashen, no bigger than a house cat, fur dull like morning ash, ears too large for his narrow head, looking up at her with eyes so calm it was almost insulting given the chaos erupting around them. She had walked into this knowing it would happen, had spent the entire morning with that knowledge pressed into her ribs like a bruise she couldn't ignore. But knowing something and living through it are two completely different things. And right now, standing in front of the Alpha King's raised dais with every noble in the kingdom staring at her scuffed boots and twice-mended cloak, she felt every ounce of that difference. The Alpha King lounged on his throne like he owned the air itself, one arm draped carelessly over the carved stone armrest, his cloak shimmering with woven silver threads that caught the afternoon light in a way that screamed wealth, power, untouchable. And when he spoke again, his voice was smooth, amused, like he was commenting on the weather instead of publicly humiliating someone who had traveled 2 days just to ask for help. "This is the royal trial ground," Kilvar said, letting the words hang there. "Not a kennel." The crowd roared, and Leora felt it like heat on her face, that familiar ache rising in her chest, the one she had carried since she was small, the ache of being tolerated at best and dismissed at worst, the same ache she felt when merchants ignored her coin, or when guards told her to stand farther back because she was blocking someone important's view. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper, a nervous habit she hated but couldn't stop, and placed herself slightly in front of Ashen without thinking, a protective instinct that probably looked pathetic to everyone watching, but felt like the only thing she could control in that moment. "Is that supposed to be a wolf?" Kilvar continued, dragging the word out like he was tasting something rotten. "Or did you pick up a street scrap and decide it needed a leash?" The laughter got louder, meaner, and a noblewoman in blue silk, too much blue, honestly, like she was trying to drown in it, laughed so hard she nearly choked, pointing at Ashen like he was the punchline to a joke only they understood. Have you ever been in a room where everyone is laughing at you and you can't do anything but stand there and take it? That's where Leora was, and it was suffocating. Ashen sat, tail curled neatly around his paws, not growling or baring teeth, just sitting there with those pale gray eyes locked on the Alpha King like he was listening to the most boring lecture in history and had already decided it wasn't worth his time. Leora swallowed hard, throat burning, and forced her voice to come out steady, even though her hands were trembling. "He's with me." That only made it worse because now Kilvar was leaning forward, eyes narrowing with that playful cruelty people in power wear when they know you can't fight back. "With you," he repeated, tasting the phrase like wine. "Then you'll remove him. We don't allow pets in royal hearings." A guard shifted, hand resting lazily on his polished spear, and the crowd leaned in closer, hungry for the moment she would break, the moment she would apologize and shuffle backward and prove that she was exactly what they thought she was, nothing. Leora felt the weight of it all pressing down, the village wells drying up back home, the crumbling stone barriers along the western fields, the faces of people who had trusted her to come back with something other than another failure. And she knew, she absolutely knew, that if she backed down now, if she let them take this from her, she would never recover. "I won't," she said, and the courtyard shifted, just a tightening, like the air itself was holding its breath. Kilvar's smile thinned into something sharper, colder. "You won't," he echoed, softer now, and that softness was somehow more terrifying than any shout. "I came to speak for my people," Leora said, choosing each word with the same care you'd use walking across ice. "He doesn't interfere, he doesn't make noise, he won't touch anything." The Alpha King arose, and that was the moment the laughter stopped, because when men like Kilvar stand up, the world pays attention, whether it wants to or not. He descended the dais slowly, boots striking stone with measured rhythm, and up close, he was taller than she expected, his presence pressing outward like a storm gathering before it breaks. "You misunderstand," Kaelvar said, stopping an arm's length away, close enough that she could see the silver threading in his cloak, the faint scar along his jaw, the absolute certainty in his eyes. "This is not a negotiation. This is an order." Ashen shifted then, just once, ears tilting back, in focus, and several guards noticed, one even taking a half step forward, like he wasn't sure what he was preparing for, but knew he should be ready. Kaelvar looked down at the small creature and chuckled, a sound that would have been warm in any context, but here felt like mockery wrapped in silt. Does it bite, or does it just stare? Leora's fingers trembled, not from fear, but from something else, a warning she had learned to recognize over the past 2 years, but never fully understood, and she watched as Ashen lifted his head slowly, deliberately, like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The light changed, just the sun slipping behind a thin cloud, but shadows sharpened along the courtyard walls, and for a single breath, the air felt thicker, like the moment before rain hits dry ground. Ashen's eyes caught the light again and did not give it back, and Leora saw it, really saw it, the way his gaze seemed older than it should be, older than stone, older than the palace itself. No one else noticed at first. Nobles were too busy whispering, guards too busy assuming victory, but Leora's breath caught because Ashen blinked once, slow and deliberate, and the stone beneath his paws whispered, ready for action. Subscribe to the channel right now if you want to see where this goes, because I'm telling you, most people click away before they find out what Ashen really is. Don't be most people. Stone does not whisper. Let me say that again in case you think I'm being dramatic. Stone does not whisper. It cracks, it chips, it breaks under pressure, sure, but whisper? No, that's the kind of detail your brain rejects immediately, like a wrong note in a song you've known your whole life. And yet, that was exactly what happened in that courtyard. A low, sliding sound moving under Ashen's paws, so soft that half the people there missed it entirely, because people rarely listen when they're too busy feeling superior and waiting for their turn to laugh. Leora felt it first through her boots, this faint vibration like someone brushing a hand along the ground beneath her feet, and for one absolutely ridiculous moment, she thought, please don't let this be my imagination embarrassing me again. Please don't let me be the only one hearing things, because if you've ever been in a situation where you notice something weird and you're terrified to point it out in case you're wrong and everyone thinks you're crazy, you know exactly what was running through her head right then. Kaelvar stopped mid-step, and the irritation that creased his brow was the kind you see on someone's face when the world has interrupted them and they haven't decided whether to be angry or just offended yet. "What is that sound?" he said, not quite yelling but heading in that direction, his head tilting slightly like he was trying to locate the source and coming up empty. The whisper became clearer, more insistent, a soft, drawn-out sigh as if the stone itself were waking up after a 1,000-year nap and was absolutely not happy about it. And I'm telling you right now, the way people's faces changed in that moment, it was priceless. Confusion mixed with denial, mixed with that creeping realization that something fundamentally wrong was happening and they had no explanation for it. A guard frowned and tapped his spear against the ground, and the sound rang out sharp and normal, too normal, like he was trying to prove to everyone, including himself, that stone still behaved the way stone was supposed to behave. And someone in the crowd muttered, "That's not magic, is it?" in this hopeful tone, like maybe if they said it wasn't magic, then it wouldn't be. Ashen sat perfectly still, and here's where I need you to understand the absolute genius of what he was doing, or not doing, really. Ashen's tail flicked once, casual as you please, and the whisper stopped. A collective breath released across the courtyard, this wave of nervous relief, and someone actually laughed, thin and unsure, trying to convince everyone that everything was fine. "Old stone settles," a nobleman said, a little too loudly, a little too insistent. "It happens." Kalvar scoffed, and you could hear the relief sharpening into annoyance in his voice. "Exactly," he said. "We're wasting time." He took another step forward, boots striking stone with that same measured confidence, and the ground dipped like the stone had briefly softened under his weight and then firmed up again, just enough to make him stumble, just enough to send him catching himself with one hand shooting out slightly for balance, and he straightened so fast his cloak snapped behind him like a flag in a storm. Silence slammed down harder than any gapple. Now everyone was listening, and I mean everyone, because the Alpha King stumbling is not something you see every day, and the implications of that stumble were starting to dawn on people in real time. Give the video a thumbs up if you are enjoying. Kalvar's face flushed red, embarrassment turning instantly to anger the way it always does when powerful people realize they've lost control of a moment. "Which one of you did that?" he snapped, spinning toward the guards with barely contained fury. "Was this some kind of trick?" No one answered, because nobody knew what to say, and in that terrible silence, you could practically hear everyone's thoughts racing, trying to find an explanation that made sense, trying to assign blame to something, anything other than the small gray creature sitting calmly beside Leora. Ashen stood, and this time everyone saw it happen, and what made it terrifying wasn't that he grew larger or started glowing or did anything dramatic. He simply stood up, stretched his narrow back like cats do after a long nap, and looked at the Alpha King with a gaze that felt ancient, old in the way mountains are old, in the way rivers remember paths long after they've dried up and disappeared from maps. Leora's mouth went dry because she'd found Ashen 2 winters ago, half buried beneath frost near the abandoned watch road, and he'd been quiet then, too. No fear, no panic, just waiting like someone who knew help would come eventually. And she'd fed him scraps, and he'd followed her home, and that was it. No oath, no bond, no magic words spoken under a full moon. And now the entire courtyard felt suddenly smaller, tighter, like the walls were leaning in to get a better look. "What is that thing?" someone whispered, and the fear in their voice was raw and real. Ashen took a single step forward, and the stone didn't whisper this time. It obeyed. A thin line etched itself across the courtyard floor, smooth and precise like a mark drawn by an invisible finger, cutting through decades of wear and weather to create something brand new, and it stopped inches from Kalvar's boots, a boundary, a line that said without words, "This far and no farther." Ashen sat again, and the casual nature of that movement, the complete lack of aggression or threat, somehow made it worse, because aggression you can respond to. Aggression gives you permission to fight back. But this quiet assertion of control, nobody knew what to do with it. No one laughed. No one even breathed properly. Subscribe now before this gets complicated, because trust me, it's about to. Kalvar stared down at the line, then at Ashen, and his confidence didn't vanish exactly, but it shifted, hardened, sharpened into something more calculating, more dangerous. "So," he said slowly, lifting his chin in that way people do when they're trying to reclaim authority through sheer force of will, "you do tricks." Leora found her voice, though it felt like pulling it up from deep underwater, like dragging something heavy and unwilling into the light. "He doesn't like being insulting," she said, and the moment the words left her mouth, she knew they were true, even though she couldn't explain how she knew, had never seen Ashen react this way before, but somehow she understood that he tolerated many things: hunger, cold, long walks, silence, but disrespect made something behind his eyes close like a door being shut. Kalvar laughed again, louder than before, too loud, the kind of laugh that's really just fear wearing a confident mask. "A mutt with manners," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "How charming." He raised his hand and snapped his fingers once, sharp and commanding. "Remove it." The guards hesitated, and that hesitation mattered more than anything else that had happened so far, because power isn't real until people believe in it, and the second they stop moving when you tell them to, the second that pause appears, the foundation starts cracking. Ashen did nothing, didn't move, didn't react, and somehow that absolute stillness did more damage than any display of force ever could. And as Leora watched the guards refusing to step forward, watched Kael'var's face cycle through emotions too fast to name, she realized with a jolt that sent electricity down her spine, they weren't afraid of what Ashen might do. They were afraid of what his existence meant, and that fear was about to change everything. Here's what you expected to happen next. Chaos, right? Screaming, guards rushing forward, maybe some dramatic fight scene where Ashen goes full supernatural beast mode and everyone learns their lesson the hard way. But that's not how real power works. And if you've ever seen someone in charge suddenly realize they're not actually in control, you know the scariest thing isn't the explosion, it's the pause right before it, that moment when everyone's brain is trying to catch up to what their eyes are seeing and failing miserably. The first guard moved, and I'm telling you right now, the look on his face told you everything you needed to know about how badly this was about to go sideways. He took one step forward, spear angled low, eyes flicking between Ashen and the Alpha King like he was trying to calculate which mistake would end his career faster, disobeying the king or approaching that small gray creature who was somehow making the entire courtyard feel like it was holding its breath. You could see it in his shoulders, the way they tensed up, the way his grip tightened on that polished spear until his knuckles went pale, and honestly, I felt bad for him. Because this poor guy was just doing his job, following orders, and now he was stuck in the middle of something way above his pay grade. Kael'var noticed the hesitation, because men like him always do. They're built to notice when people stop obeying instantly, when that split-second delay appears between command and action, and you could practically see his jaw tighten. "Now," he snapped, voice clipped and sharp enough to cut glass. "Remove the animal." The guard swallowed hard enough that his throat bobbed, took another step, and that's when Ashen lifted his head. Not dramatically, not with any kind of snarl or show of teeth, just lifted it, slow and calm, the way you look up from a book when someone's been talking at you for too long and you finally decided you're done pretending to be polite. And here's the absolutely wild part that I need you to understand. The guard stopped smiling. He hadn't been smiling much to begin with, sure, but whatever tiny shred of confidence he'd been wearing drained right out of his face like someone pulled a plug, and his body leaned back just slightly, just enough that you knew his instincts had made a decision his brain was still arguing with. The stone line on the ground, the one Ashen had drawn earlier without even trying, pulsed. Not glowing, not flashing like some cheap magic trick, just a subtle shift, like when you're staring at water and you see the current change direction, and you can't quite explain how you noticed, but you absolutely did. Leora felt it in her chest, that same warning ache she'd been carrying around like a bad secret, pressing against her ribs harder now, and she wanted to grab Ashen, pull him back, apologize to everyone, and disappear into the road and never come near carved stone and silver thrones again. But her feet wouldn't move, because sometimes your body knows better than your mind what you actually need to do. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew running was the smart choice, but something kept you planted there anyway? That was Leora. And honestly, that was probably half the nobles in that courtyard too, because nobody was moving. Everyone was just watching, waiting to see who would blink first. Kael'var laughed, but it was short and humorless, the kind of laugh that's really just anger wearing a mask. "What is this?" he said, not quite yelling, but getting close. "You're afraid of a pet?" The word landed wrong. You could feel it, the way the air got heavier, the way even the banners overhead seemed to hang a little more still, and Ashen stood again. This time, the courtyard reacted, not with panic or screams, but with that collective lean forward that happens when a crowd's curiosity finally overpowers its caution, when people can't help themselves anymore and they just have to see what happens next. Nobles craned their necks, guards adjusted their stances. One advisor actually stood up from his seat, which, if you know anything about royal protocol, is basically the equivalent of shouting, "Something's wrong," in the middle of a library. Ashen stepped over the line he'd drawn. The stone didn't crack. It flowed. Like warm clay being pressed by invisible hands, the courtyard floor reshaped itself under his paws, rising just enough to form shallow ridges, nothing dramatic, nothing destructive, just responsive, like the ground itself was saying, "Oh, you're walking here? Let me adjust for you." Someone whispered, "That's not possible." And they were absolutely right, which is exactly why everyone kept staring, because impossible things have this nasty habit of being the most interesting things in any room. Kaelvar's smile faltered, just a flicker, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it, and Leora was watching very, very closely, because she'd spent her entire life reading the faces of people who thought they were better than her, learning to spot the exact moment their confidence cracked. "You there," Kaelvar snapped, pointing at her as if somehow she was responsible for physics deciding to take a vacation. "What have you brought into my court?" She flinched at the word brought, as if Ashen were a weapon she'd smuggled in, a trick she'd prepared, and not just a creature who'd followed her to the gate and refused to stay behind. "He followed me," she said, because the truth was simple and didn't need decoration, didn't need excuses. Ashen glanced back at her, and for one brief, private moment, his gaze softened. Not affection exactly, but understanding, the kind of look that says, "I know this is hard, but we're doing it anyway." Then he looked at the guards again, and the stone ridges rose another inch. That was enough. No one advanced. Not one single guard took another step, and that silence, that collective decision to just stop moving, was louder than any battle cry could ever be. And here's the thing about authority that most people don't talk about. It's not real until people believe in it. And the second they stop believing, the second they hesitate, it starts crumbling faster than old bread. Kaelvar straightened, drawing himself up to his full height, trying to reclaim the moment through sheer presence. "You will leave," he said, voice cold now, stripped of amusement. "Both of you." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some relieved that the tension was breaking, some disappointed because, let's be honest, people always want more. They always want to see how far things will go. Leora felt something twist in her stomach, sharp and bitter, because leaving meant failure, meant going back to her village empty-handed, meant watching people's hope die in their eyes when she had nothing to offer them. Ashen did not move. "I said..." The stone beneath Kaelvar's boots sank, just enough to throw his balance, just enough to make it crystal clear this wasn't an accident, wasn't a coincidence, and the entire courtyard saw it, saw him stumble, saw him uncertain. Ashen lowered his head, not submissive, not threatening, just deliberate, that kind of movement that says without words, "You are not in control of this moment anymore, and we both know it." For the first time since he opened his mouth, Kaelvar chose his next words carefully, and you could hear it in his voice, that shift from command to calculation. "Escort them," he said, quieter now, measured, "to the holding wing." The crowd buzzed instantly, because holding wing meant delay, meant investigation, meant this wasn't over, and as two guards stepped forward slowly, respectfully, carefully avoiding direct eye contact with Ashen, Leora caught fragments of whispered conversation floating through the courtyard like smoke. "Did you see the ground move? That wasn't any magic I recognize." The king looked unsure. "Subscribe before this gets darker, because trust me, it does." Ashen padded beside her as they walked towards the massive doors of the inner keep, calm as ever, and as those doors closed behind them, sealing out the sunlight and the noise, one thing became painfully, beautifully clear. This was no longer about a mutt in a courtyard, and whatever was about to happen next, the kingdom wasn't ready for it. The door closed with a sound that wasn't loud, but felt final. Like the kind of click you hear when someone locks you in and walks away humming. And I need you to understand something about rooms designed to make you feel small. They're never accidental. The holding wing smelled like cold stone and old decisions, not rot or filth exactly, just neglect. The kind reserved for people who aren't important enough to impress, but not disposable enough to forget. And Leora noticed that detail immediately, because when you grow up on the edge of attention, you learn to read rooms the way other people read faces. Two guards stopped at a narrow chamber with no windows and a single bench carved directly from the wall. And here's what got me. They didn't shove her inside, didn't chain her hands, didn't even raise their voices. One actually cleared his throat awkwardly like he wanted to apologize but didn't know how, which somehow made it worse because at least cruelty you can hate, but uncomfortable politeness, that just sits in your chest like a stone. Ashen walked in first, and the floor smoothed itself beneath his paws, so subtle that only Leora caught it, that slight shift like the stone was saying, "Oh, you're here, let me make this easier." And she sat heavily on the bench, heart still racing from the courtyard, and let the silence stretch, because silence can be useful if you let it. People fill it when they're uncomfortable, and you learn things they didn't mean to tell you. The guards lingered near the doorway, shifting their weight. "I've never seen that," one muttered to the other, trying to be quiet but failing spectacularly because anxiety makes people lousy at whispering. "Don't," the second one hissed back, sharper, more afraid. "Just don't." They left, and the latch slid into place with a soft, metallic click, and Leora finally exhaled, this shaky, almost laugh that came out when your body realizes it's still alive and hasn't decided what to do with that information yet. "Well," she said softly, rubbing her palms on her knees hard enough to leave red marks, a nervous habit she'd picked up years ago and never managed to shake. "That went badly." Ashen settled beside her, curling his tail neatly around his paws, leaning his shoulder against her leg with that solid warmth that felt like the only real thing in a room full of uncertainty. And she closed her eyes for just a moment, because if you've ever been in a situation where the immediate danger passed, but you know the real problem is just getting started, you understand this feeling. The pause isn't relief, it's dread wrapped in temporary safety. Let me tell you something most stories skip over because they're too busy rushing to the next big moment. The danger isn't always the obvious threat, the raised voice, or the drawn sword. It's the pause afterward, the space where people go away and think. Because thinking is where power sharpens its knives, where people turn what just happened into what we're going to do about it. And that transformation is always, always worse than the original problem. They didn't wait long. Footsteps approached, measured and confident, not the heavy boots of guards, but the lighter, more deliberate steps of people who never get their hands dirty, but somehow control everything. The door opened without knocking because, why would it? She was basically a prisoner, even if nobody had said the word out loud, and 3 figures entered. 2 men in layered robes, faces thin and careful like they'd spent years practicing expressions that revealed nothing, and 1 woman with silver-threaded cuffs and eyes like polished glass, the kind of eyes that see everything and judge it all in the same glance. Advisors, the architects of consequences. "Leora of the Western Flats," the woman said, not unkindly but not warmly either, just stating a fact. "You've caused quite a stir." Leora lifted her chin, trying to project confidence she absolutely did not feel. "I didn't mean to." The woman smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "That is what worries us." Ashen didn't move, but somehow his stillness felt louder than any growl could have been, and one of the men glanced at him, then quickly away, like looking at the sun for too long, like his brain was screaming at him that staring was a bad idea. "That creature," he said, choosing each word with surgical precision, "displays unusual properties." "He's not a thing," Leora said, and she felt heat creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to stay calm, because there's only so many times you can hear someone reduce a living being to an object before anger overrides fear. "And he didn't hurt anyone." "No," the woman agreed smoothly, folding her hands in front of her like a teacher about to explain why you're wrong. "But he embarrassed the king." There it was, stripped of pretense and laid bare. The real crime wasn't danger or disruption. It was making someone powerful look uncertain in front of people who expected certainty. And if you've ever gotten in trouble not for what you did, but for making someone else look bad, you know exactly how rigged this game is. The man who'd spoken before nodded slowly. "You must understand how this looks. A common villager arrives unannounced, brings an unregistered entity into royal grounds, demonstrates uncontrolled environmental influence." Leora frowned, her stomach dropping. "Uncontrolled?" Exactly, he said, like she'd just proven his point for him. Ashen's ears twitched, just once, and Leora felt the bench beneath her hum faintly, not enough to be threatening, but enough to remind everyone in that small room that the walls were very much paying attention to this conversation. The guard stiffened, and you could see it happen in real time, that moment when people realized the script they'd prepared might not work the way they planned. "Control him," one of the men snapped, losing his composure for half a heartbeat, voice cracking slightly. Leora stood, placing a hand lightly on Ashen's back, feeling the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "He's calm," she said quietly. "You're the ones escalating." The woman studied her then, really studied her, not as a nuisance anymore, but as something more complicated, a variable that didn't fit neatly into the boxes they'd prepared. "This doesn't have to end badly," she said, and her tone shifted into something that might have been genuine concern, if you didn't know better. "If you cooperate." Cooperate. Leora knew exactly what that word meant. Hand Ashen over, admit fault, let them bury whatever truth they scared under a stack of official language and forgotten paperwork, go home and tell her village that she'd tried and failed, and they should probably start getting used to dry wells and crumbling walls. Ashen looked up at her, not urging, not commanding, just waiting. And in that quiet, stone-bound room where even the air felt like it was holding its breath, Leora realized something that sent ice through her veins. They weren't afraid of what Ashen could do, not really, because power they could understand, power they could measure and contain and control. No. They were afraid of what he represented, the idea that their authority, their carefully maintained hierarchy, their entire system of who matters and who doesn't, could be challenged by something that didn't ask permission, didn't follow their rules, didn't care about their crowns and silver-threaded cloaks. And fear, once it settles into the bones of power, never lets go without a fight, which meant this was just the beginning, and whatever came next was going to be worse than anything she'd imagined. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "We'll give you time to think about it," she said, which really meant time to realize you have no choice. And as the three advisors filed out of the room, leaving Leora and Ashen alone again in that windowless chamber, she heard one of them whisper just loud enough to catch, "Prepare the proving paths. We'll need to assess its limits." Those words hung in the air long after the door closed, and Leora's hands started shaking again, not from fear of Ashen, but fear for him, because she'd heard stories about the proving paths, about what happened to things that didn't fit into neat categories, and none of those stories ended well. They didn't call it a trial at first, which should have been Leora's first clue that she was walking into something designed to look reasonable while being anything but. Because here's what powerful people do when they want to destroy you. They wrap it in procedure. They call it a clarification hearing, like they're doing you a favor by letting you explain yourself. And they make sure everyone in the room already knows the conclusion before you even open your mouth. Leora learned that lesson the moment they escorted her from the holding wing into a hall shaped like a long, shallow bowl, rows of officials seated higher than the floor so they could literally look down on her. And if you've ever had a teacher call you to the front of the class while everyone else stays seated, watching, judging, you understand this design immediately. It's not about finding truth, it's about making you feel small until you believe you deserve whatever punishment they've already decided on. No throne this time, no crowd packed tight with laughter, just cold efficiency. And somehow that was worse, because at least mockery is honest about what it is. The woman with the silver cuffs took her place at the center desk and said, "This will be brief," which was the first lie of many, because nothing in that room was going to be brief, nothing was going to be fair, and Leora could feel it in the air, like humidity before a storm. They began with small things, questions that sounded harmless, almost friendly. Where did you find the creature? How long has it been with you? Has it ever caused irregularities before? And Leora answered plainly, because what else could she do? She didn't embellish, didn't apologize for existing. She'd learned the hard way that apologizing only teaches people to demand more. Ashen remained silent beside her, and I'm telling you, the way he just sat there, unbothered, calm as if this were a pleasant afternoon walk instead of a room full of people trying to figure out how to make him disappear legally, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and honestly, it was probably both. Then the tone shifted, and you could feel it happen, that subtle change in the air when people stop pretending to care about facts and start building toward the conclusion they wanted all along. A man stood from the back row, robes edged in dark red like he dipped them in wine or blood, and his voice came out smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who'd destroyed people before and knew exactly how to do it again. "We have received testimony," he said, letting the word testimony hang there like it meant something sacred, that the entity reacted aggressively to royal authority. Leora frowned, her stomach dropping. "It didn't," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they didn't matter, because this wasn't about what actually happened, this was about what they could convince everyone else had happened. The man nodded with this oily sympathy that made her skin crawl. "From your perspective," he said, like her perspective was cute but irrelevant, like a child insisting the sky is green when everyone knows it's blue. Another official chimed in, this one younger, eager to prove himself. "Witnesses report structural instability coinciding with its movements," he said, and the way he phrased it, so technical, so detached, made it sound like Ashen had done something deliberately dangerous instead of just existing in a space that apparently couldn't handle him. "Instability?" Leora repeated, tasting the word, hating it. "Nothing broke, no one got hurt." "But it could have," the man in red said smoothly, and there it was, the favorite weapon of people who never have to prove anything. Could have, might have, potentially. All these words that let you punish someone for crimes they didn't commit because maybe, possibly, they could have in some imaginary version of events. Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do and watched people twist your words until even you started doubting your own memory? That's where Leora was, and it was suffocating. Ashen's ears flicked once, just once, and Leora felt the bench beneath her hum faintly, a reminder that he was still there, still real, still undeniably himself, no matter how many words they threw around to try and reshape reality. The woman with the silver cuffs leaned forward, hands folded, voice dropping into this reasonable tone that was somehow more threatening than any shout. "We must determine whether this being poses a risk to the realm," she said, and Leora's pulse quickened because she could see where this was heading, could feel the trap closing. "You mean whether he makes you uncomfortable," Leora said, and the words came out sharper than she'd intended, hot and angry, because sometimes you reach a point where politeness feels like betrayal, and you just can't keep swallowing your own voice. A few heads snapped up, whispers rippled through the room, and the woman's gaze sharpened into something cold and cutting. "Careful," she said, and that single word carried more threat than an entire speech could have. And here's where lesser stories would let the hero win by shouting louder or suddenly revealing some hidden power. But this story doesn't work that way, because real systems don't break when you yell at them. They just tighten their grip. They add your outburst to the list of reasons you're problematic, and they use your anger as proof that you were the problem all along. A side door opened and two nobles entered, faces already arranged into expressions of concern and civic duty, voices prepared and rehearsed. "We saw it," one said immediately, not waiting to be asked, because that's how staged testimony works. It comes in hot, confident, unshakable. The creature advanced, the ground reacted violently. Violently, Leora almost laughed, would have laughed if her throat wasn't so tight, because the ground had shifted maybe an inch, had created a small line, nothing violent about it unless you were determined to see violence where there was only response. "That's not what happened," Leora said, hearing the desperation creeping into her voice and hating it. "It stepped forward, that's all." The second noble scoffed, and the contempt in that sound was designed to make her feel stupid. "You expect us to believe the stone moved on its own, like she was asking them to believe in fairy tales." Ashen shifted his weight, subtle, controlled, and the stone did nothing, stayed perfectly still, and that was almost worse, because without the spectacle, without the undeniable proof happening right now in front of everyone, all Leora had was her word, and in rooms like this, words only have weight if they come from the right mouths, if they're wrapped in the right titles, and spoken with the right accent. The woman folded her hands, and Leora knew what was coming before she even spoke. "We must determine whether this being poses a risk to the realm," she said, and Leora's pulse quickened because she could see where this was heading, could feel the trap closing. "You mean whether he makes you uncomfortable," Leora said, and the words came out sharper than she'd intended, hot and angry, because sometimes you reach a point where politeness feels like betrayal, and you just can't keep swallowing your own voice. A few heads snapped up, whispers rippled through the room, and the woman's gaze sharpened into something cold and cutting. "Careful," she said, and that single word carried more threat than an entire speech could have. And here's where lesser stories would let the hero win by shouting louder or suddenly revealing some hidden power. But this story doesn't work that way, because real systems don't break when you yell at them. They just tighten their grip. They add your outburst to the list of reasons you're problematic, and they use your anger as proof that you were the problem all along. A side door opened and two nobles entered, faces already arranged into expressions of concern and civic duty, voices prepared and rehearsed. "We saw it," one said immediately, not waiting to be asked, because that's how staged testimony works. It comes in hot, confident, unshakable. The creature advanced, the ground reacted violently. Violently, Leora almost laughed, would have laughed if her throat wasn't so tight, because the ground had shifted maybe an inch, had created a small line, nothing violent about it unless you were determined to see violence where there was only response. "That's not what happened," Leora said, hearing the desperation creeping into her voice and hating it. "It stepped forward, that's all." The second noble scoffed, and the contempt in that sound was designed to make her feel stupid. "You expect us to believe the stone moved on its own, like she was asking them to believe in fairy tales." Ashen shifted his weight, subtle, controlled, and the stone did nothing, stayed perfectly still, and that was almost worse, because without the spectacle, without the undeniable proof happening right now in front of everyone, all Leora had was her word, and in rooms like this, words only have weight if they come from the right mouths, if they're wrapped in the right titles, and spoken with the right accent. The woman folded her hands, and Leora knew what was coming before she even spoke. "We must determine whether this being poses a risk to the realm," she said, and Leora's pulse quickened because she could see where this was heading, could feel the trap closing. "You mean whether he makes you uncomfortable," Leora said, and the words came out sharper than she'd intended, hot and angry, because sometimes you reach a point where politeness feels like betrayal, and you just can't keep swallowing your own voice. A few heads snapped up, whispers rippled through the room, and the woman's gaze sharpened into something cold and cutting. "Careful," she said, and that single word carried more threat than an entire speech could have. And here's where lesser stories would let the hero win by shouting louder or suddenly revealing some hidden power. But this story doesn't work that way, because real systems don't break when you yell at them. They just tighten their grip. They add your outburst to the list of reasons you're problematic, and they use your anger as proof that you were the problem all along. A side door opened and two nobles entered, faces already arranged into expressions of concern and civic duty, voices prepared and rehearsed. "We saw it," one said immediately, not waiting to be asked, because that's how staged testimony works. It comes in hot, confident, unshakable. The creature advanced, the ground reacted violently. Violently. Leora almost laughed, would have laughed if her throat wasn't so tight, because the ground had shifted maybe an inch, had created a small line, nothing violent about it, unless you were determined to see violence where there was only response. "That's not what happened," she said, hearing the desperation creeping into her voice and hating it. "It stepped forward, that's all." The second noble scoffed, and the contempt in that sound was designed to make her feel stupid. "You expect us to believe the stone moved on its own?" he said, like she was asking them to believe in fairy tales. Ashen shifted his weight, subtle, controlled, and the stone did nothing, stayed perfectly still, and that was almost worse, because without the spectacle, without the undeniable proof happening right now in front of everyone, all Leora had was her word. And in rooms like this, words only have weight if they come from the right mouths, if they're wrapped in the right titles, and spoken with the right accent. The woman folded her hands, and Leora knew what was coming before she even spoke. Given the uncertainty, she said, voice smooth as silk over steel, we propose a controlled assessment. Leora's stomach dropped so hard she felt it in her knees. Assessment? A test, the woman clarified, like she was offering a gift instead of a trap, to observe the creature's limits. Ashen looked at Leora then, head tilted slightly, and in that look she saw a question she couldn't quite translate, but felt in her bones. Trust me, it said. Or maybe it said, trust yourself. Or maybe it was just asking if she was ready for what came next. This was the trap, elegant and brutal in its simplicity. If she refused, they'd declare her uncooperative, file her away as someone who couldn't be reasoned with, and whatever happened to Ashen after that would happen without her. But if she agreed, they would design something meant to make him fail, meant to give them the excuse they needed to do whatever they'd already decided to do. What kind of test? Leora asked carefully, each word costing her something. The man in red smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, doesn't reach anywhere near genuine. The old corridors beneath the keep, he said, the proving paths. Leora had heard of them, everyone had, those twisting stone passages used long ago to test things that didn't fit neatly into categories, officially abandoned, but unofficially still used as a place where inconvenient truths went to be measured, labeled, and quietly buried. And if he passes, she said, knowing the answer but needing to hear them say it. The woman hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough to tell Leora everything. We will reconsider our stance, she said, and the word reconsider was so beautifully vague it could mean absolutely anything or nothing at all. Comment below if you take this deal or walk away, because honestly, I'm not sure what the right answer is. Leora looked down at Ashen, his steady gaze, his patient presence, and she thought of her village, the dry wells, the crumbling walls, the people who had watched her leave with hope they were too afraid to speak out loud. Fine, she said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff, but I go with him. The advisors exchanged glances, quick calculations passing between them. Of course, the woman said, too quickly, too easily, and that ease told Leora this was exactly what they'd wanted all along. As they turned toward the door, Ashen brushed his shoulder against her leg, solid and grounding, and walking down into those lower halls, with torches casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, Leora felt the truth settle into her bones with crushing certainty. This test was never about what Ashen could do. It was about giving the court permission to be afraid, and fear, once written into official records, becomes impossible to erase.
The first thing you need to know about the proving paths is that they're not actually paths. They're a test wrapped in architecture pretending to be neutral. And the moment Leora stepped into them, she felt it in her teeth, that low-frequency hum that makes your molars ache and your stomach turn, the kind of sensation that tells your body something is fundamentally wrong here, even if your eyes can't quite figure out what. The air smelled like secrets. Not metaphorically, I mean it literally had this metallic taste that coated the back of your throat, like someone had been storing old decisions and broken promises down here for so long they'd started to ferment. And if you've ever walked into a basement that hasn't been opened in years and felt that first breath of stale wrongness, multiply that by about 1,000. Torches lined the walls at regular intervals, too regular, too perfect. And here's where things got weird immediately. They flickered when Ashen walked past them, not from wind, because these corridors were sealed tighter than a vault, but from his presence alone. Shadows bending toward him like they were curious, like the darkness itself was leaning in to get a better look. Leora noticed it before the guards escorting them did, watched the way light seemed to curve slightly around Ashen's body, and she bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood because if anyone else saw it, they'd use it as proof of something dangerous, something that needed to be contained. "Keep moving," one of the guards muttered, not unkindly but not warmly either, voice tight with the kind of discomfort people get when they're following orders they don't fully understand. And honestly, I felt bad for these guys because they were just doing their jobs, and now they were stuck babysitting a girl and her reality-bending companion in corridors that probably gave them nightmares as kids. The first real shift happened maybe 10 steps in. The floor dipped under Leora's boot. Not a collapse, not a hole, just this subtle indentation, like the stone had exhaled beneath her weight and was waiting to see what she'd do about it. She stumbled, caught herself against the wall, and the cold stone under her palm felt wrong somehow, too smooth, too aware. And Ashen paused to look back at her with that patient tilt of his head that seemed to say, "Pay attention, this is important. The corridors are testing you already." Have you ever been somewhere that felt like it was actively trying to make you uncomfortable? Not dangerous exactly, just persistently, exhaustingly wrong. The hall narrowed without warning, walls sliding inward so gradually you almost didn't notice until suddenly you were squeezing sideways, shoulder scraping against stone that felt colder than it should. And Leora's breath came faster, because tight spaces have always made her chest feel tight, have always reminded her of being small and powerless and trapped. Ashen moved through the narrowing section like it was nothing, like the walls were adjusting for him instead of the other way around, tail brushing lightly against stone without making a sound. And she wanted to hate him a little bit for making it look so easy when she was over here fighting down panic. "Observe carefully," a voice echoed from somewhere above, the woman with the silver cuffs, apparently monitoring through hidden openings in the ceiling, and Leora rolled her eyes so hard it actually hurt, because of course they were watching. Of course they couldn't just let her face this without an audience. Powerful people are physically incapable of not watching things they claim to be above. The path widened again, opening into a chamber lined with mirrors, tall and narrow, stretching from floor to ceiling, and Leora's reflection appeared multiple times over, perfectly still at first, just her standing there looking exhausted and scared and way too young for whatever this was. Then the mirrors began to ripple, subtle distortions that started at the edges and moved inward, and suddenly she was seeing not just herself, but versions of herself, failing, falling, going home empty-handed while her village dried up and crumbled. Faces she knew looking at her with disappointment so heavy it felt physical. The mirrors weren't showing her worst fears exactly, they were showing her most likely failures, the realistic ways this could all go wrong. And that's so much worse than monsters or demons, because you can't fight probability, you can't punch statistics in the face and make them go away. Leora felt her breath catch, felt that familiar spiral where one bad thought leads to another, and suddenly you're drowning in your own head. And she wanted to look away from the mirrors but couldn't, because some part of her believed she deserved to see this, deserved to face exactly how badly she was probably going to fail. Ashen stepped between her and the mirrors, blocked her view completely, and when she blinked and looked back at him, his pale gray eyes held something that wasn't quite sympathy, but definitely wasn't judgment either, more like understanding, like he'd seen people break themselves against their own doubts before, and wasn't about to let it happen to her. Comment below if you've ever had someone step in just when you needed them most, because those moments change everything. The mirrors stopped rippling the second Ashen blocked them, went still and normal, just regular reflective surfaces showing nothing but stone and torchlight, and Leora let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, hands shaking as she wiped sweat from her forehead, even though the corridors were cold enough to see her breath. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, partly to Ashen, partly to the corridors themselves, and they pressed forward into the next section where the floor became a series of tiles that shifted slightly under each step, not enough to throw you off balance, but enough to keep you constantly adjusting, constantly aware that solid ground was an illusion these corridors would happily strip away if you stopped paying attention. The tiles responded to Ashen differently than they did to Leora. Under his paws, they settled, firmed up, became more stable, while under her boots, they remained uncertain, testing, and she realized with a jolt that sent ice through her veins that the proving paths weren't measuring Ashen's power at all. They were measuring her trust, her willingness to follow him into spaces that shouldn't exist, her ability to believe in something that defied every rule she'd been taught about how the world worked. A draft ran through the corridor, even though there were no openings, no windows, no source for moving air, and it carried whispers that sounded almost like words, almost like warnings, voices she couldn't quite make out but felt in her bones were telling her to turn back, to give up, to accept that some things are too big for people like her to challenge. Ashen's ears flicked forward, listening to something she couldn't hear, and he changed direction slightly, leading her down a passage that looked identical to all the others, but somehow felt different, felt right, and she followed without questioning, because questioning at this point meant admitting she had no idea what she was doing, and that admission would break whatever fragile confidence was keeping her moving forward. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, and the moment they stepped inside, Leora felt it. This was the real test, not the mirrors or the shifting tiles or the whispers, but whatever waited in this space that felt bigger than it should, darker than torchlight could explain, and she knew with absolute certainty that what happened next would determine not just whether they passed the assessment, but whether she ever made it home at all. And somewhere far above them, Kael'var was watching, waiting to see her break.
The moment Ashen stepped into the chamber at the heart of the proving paths, Leora's stomach dropped so hard she could swear she felt it scrape against her spine. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. This wasn't just another room. This was the kind of place designed to pry secrets out of the marrow of your bones. Walls carved and etched with patterns that made your eyes hurt if you looked too long. Ceilings so high it disappeared into shadow. And the whole space feeling like it was watching you, judging you, waiting for you to prove you didn't belong here. Why do they make everything so theatrical? Leora whispered, more to herself than to Ashen, but he heard her anyway because that creature heard everything. And if you've ever been in a place that felt actively hostile to your presence, where even the air seemed to be on someone else's side, you know exactly why her hands were shaking. Ashen moved forward like he owned the place, paws making no sound, body flowing like wind over water, and every step seemed to draw the room toward him in this way that wasn't magical exactly, but definitely wasn't normal either. And Leora found herself wondering, not for the first time, if she'd been fooling herself all these years thinking she understood anything about him at all. The first challenge revealed itself as a series of shifting tiles, narrow paths stretched over a shallow pit filled with sand and broken stones, not deep enough to kill you, but definitely deep enough to hurt, designed to make you hesitate, to make you second-guess every step, because hesitation is what these tests feed on. It leads to mistakes. Mistakes lead to judgment. Judgment leads to the very specific kind of ruin that powerful people love to watch from a safe distance. "Just walk," she muttered under her breath, biting her thumbnail hard enough to taste blood, another nervous habit she'd picked up somewhere along the way. "Don't think, just walk." Ashen stepped forward with that same measured confidence, and as he did, the tiles subtly rearranged themselves to accommodate him, not breaking, not bending beyond what stone should do, just adjusting like the proving paths themselves were acknowledging who actually had command of this situation. And Leora felt her mouth go dry because watching physics politely step aside for a creature no bigger than a house cat was the kind of thing that breaks your brain if you think about it too hard. They reached a wider chamber filled with suspended chains that clicked softly in the draft, creating this rhythmic sound that got inside your head and made it hard to think straight. And a cold wind ran through even though they were deep underground where wind shouldn't exist. But Ashen didn't flinch, didn't even pause, and his steadiness was the only thing keeping Leora from completely falling apart. Then came the whisper, except this time it wasn't from the walls or the stone, it was from inside her own head, that nasty little voice that sounds like you, but meaner, crueler, more honest about your worst fears. "You're going to fail," it said. "Everyone watching knows it. Everyone back home knows it. You're not special. You're not brave. You're just a girl who got lucky finding a creature she doesn't understand, and now you're about to pay for that presumption." The pressure of it hit her like a physical weight. Every noble who'd laughed at her, every guard who'd looked through her like she was invisible, every moment of her life spent being tolerated instead of respected, and suddenly she understood with perfect clarity. The corridors weren't testing Ashen at all. They were testing her, testing whether she would break under the weight of her own doubt, whether she would prove them right by proving herself wrong. She froze mid-step, one foot hovering over a tile that suddenly looked far less stable than it had a second ago. Ashen glanced back at her, and the look he gave her was sharp but patient, knowing but not judging, the kind of look that says, "I trust you. Now you need to trust me, but more importantly, you need to trust yourself." Have you ever had someone believe in you more than you believed in yourself? It's terrifying because suddenly you can't hide behind the excuse that nobody expected anything from you anyway. Trust is a strange weapon, and I mean that literally. You can wield it like a sword, but only if you're willing to stand completely exposed, only if you're ready to let go of every excuse, every safety net, every reason why it's okay to fail because at least you tried. Leora's hands were shaking, her throat tight, every instinct screaming at her to doubt, to overthink, to hesitate just long enough to make the mistake that would prove everyone right. "Walk," she breathed, and she didn't know if she was talking to herself or to Ashen or to the corridors themselves. She took a step, and the tile held, and Ashen moved forward with her, half a pace ahead, guiding without dragging, steadying without controlling. The tiles shifted beneath them like the proving paths were learning to cooperate, bending without breaking, respecting without surrendering, and halfway across, Leora's foot hit a tile wrong, felt it dip slightly under her weight, and her heart launched into a full sprint as she looked down, expecting chaos, expecting the fall she'd been anticipating since they'd entered this place. Nothing happened. Ashen's paw rested next to hers on the same tile, solid and calm, and if he could speak without words, she knew exactly what he'd say. "It's okay, we're doing this together. You're not alone, even when it feels like you are." Trust, built slowly, tested constantly, and wielded like a weapon sharp enough to carve open walls, both literal and metaphorical. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she looked ahead at the final stretch, narrow and steep, lined with carvings that seemed to leer at her from the shadows, faces twisted in expressions she couldn't quite read, but felt in her gut were meant to unsettle, meant to make her question everything one more time before the end. One wrong thought, she knew, one flicker of doubt strong enough to take root, and she would lose not just this test, but everything, her village's hope, Ashen's safety, the tiny, fragile possibility that maybe the world didn't have to work the way it always had. Ashen didn't hesitate, and suddenly she couldn't either, because trust isn't something you think about, it's something you do, and she moved forward step by careful step, feeling the corridors watch and wait, and maybe, just maybe, begin to understand that they'd underestimated what happens when someone who's been dismissed their entire life finally finds something worth standing up for. They reached the other side, and the proving paths opened into a larger chamber, one that felt different, felt final, and Leora knew with absolute certainty that whatever waited beyond that doorway wasn't just another test of Ashen's abilities, it was a confrontation with Kylvar himself, and this time there would be no audience to hide behind, no procedures to soften the blow, just raw truth meeting raw power, and someone was going to have to bend. The doors opened with a groan, like metal bones stretching after centuries of sleep. And I'm going to tell you right now that Leora knew, the second she heard that sound, that she was walking into something designed to destroy her. Not with swords or chains, but with shame, with the kind of public dismantling that leaves you breathing but hollowed out. And if you've ever walked into a room where everyone was already talking about you before you arrived, where the verdict was written before you said a single word, you know exactly what her legs felt like as she stepped through that doorway.
The echo of her boots was too loud, announcing her fear to everyone present, and she hated it. Hated how every footstep seemed to broadcast exactly how terrified she was, while Ashen moved beside her, unbothered, calm as if you were stepping through a summer meadow instead of the heart of the Alpha King's judgment chamber. The nobles rose just enough to remind her who controlled the air she was breathing, not standing fully because that would imply respect, just lifting slightly in their seats, a gesture that said, "We acknowledge your presence the way we acknowledge insects," and the weight of their collective stare pressed down on her shoulders like hands pushing her toward the floor. Calvar sat at the far end in a chair that wasn't quite a throne, but somehow felt more threatening because of it. And here's what caught Leora's attention immediately. His hands weren't resting comfortably on the armrests. They were twitching slightly, fingers drumming an irregular rhythm, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not amusement, but doubt flickering behind the mask of authority like a candle struggling in wind. He had expected this to be simple, she realized, had planned for a mutt to be humiliated and a girl to be chastised and a lesson in obedience to be delivered. But instead, uncertainty had walked through his doors wearing fur and patience, and powerful people hate uncertainty more than they hate actual threats, because threats you can fight, but uncertainty, that just sits there and corrodes. The chamber smelled faintly of ink and parchment, but more than that it carried tension thick enough to chew, every noble leaning forward slightly like their interest alone could bend reality, and Leora felt more exposed than she'd ever been in her life, more watched, more judged, more painfully aware of every scuffed boot and twice-mended seam. "Bring it forward," Calvar said finally, voice steady but sharper than steel that's been polished too many times, trying to cut with precision instead of force. Ashen stepped ahead without hesitation, and Leora followed, feeling her pulse in her throat, in her fingertips, in every nerve ending that was screaming at her to run, to apologize, to make herself smaller until she disappeared entirely. And here's the cruel genius of what they designed. This wasn't a test of Ashen's power or obedience. It was a test of her courage, her composure, her ability to stand upright under the weight of people who'd spent their entire lives learning how to make others fold. A noble sneered from the second row, face twisted with contempt that he wore like jewelry. "A common villager bringing that creature into our midst?" he said, voice dripping with disgust. "Do you expect us to take you seriously? Have you ever wanted to answer a question so badly that staying silent felt like swallowing glass?" Leora bit her lip hard enough to hurt, because an outburst would be filed away as weakness, catalogued as insubordination, used against her later when they wanted proof she'd been unreasonable all along. Her hands tightened at her sides until her nails dug into her palms. And Ashen leaned forward slightly, just enough to remind her that hesitation here would cost more than pride. It could cost everything. Then Calvar did something that changed the temperature of the entire chamber. He leaned forward, not threateningly, not angrily, just forward, like a predator studying a puzzle it couldn't quite solve. And the curiosity in that movement was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. "Show me," he said. Just 2 words, but they landed heavy enough to echo through every corner of the chamber. Leora's stomach sank because she knew what he meant, knew he wanted proof, wanted spectacle, wanted Ashen to perform like a trained animal so they could measure him, classify him, decide his fate based on how entertaining or frightening his abilities were. She wanted to refuse, wanted to grab Ashen and run and pretend none of this had ever happened, but Ashen nudged her gently with her shoulder, a grounding touch, a reminder that they'd already come too far to back down now. The first shift came almost immediately, subtle but undeniable. The floor beneath Ashen paws rippled like water disturbed by wind, and nobles gasped quietly, that polite almost whisper that said, "This is shocking, but I'm too dignified to show it fully." And Leora heard every single intake of breath like they were personal accusations. The stone bent and reshaped slightly under Ashen, creating a smooth, curved path leading directly toward Calvar, not in aggression, not in challenge, but in undeniable assertion, a statement that said, I'm coming forward because I choose to, not because you commanded it, and that distinction mattered more than any display of raw power ever could. Calvar's eyes flickered just for a second, just long enough for Leora to catch it, and that flicker was worth everything. Every humiliation, every sleepless night traveling here, every moment of doubt, because she was watching the most powerful man in the kingdom hesitate, watching him realize the rules he thought were absolute were actually just agreements everyone had decided to follow, and agreements can be broken. One noble gasped louder, forgot to be polite about it. "Impossible," she breathed. "Stone shouldn't move like that." Another whispered, "What is it really?" And the fear in his voice was raw and honest. Ashen paused, then lowered his head slightly toward Leora, and for a brief, shocking second, the power in that calm gesture was enough to silence the entire chamber. Nobles leaning forward despite themselves, guards stiffening, even Calvar's nervous drumming stopped. "Control him," an advisor hissed from somewhere to the left, voice shaking despite the calm tone he was trying to project. And Leora almost laughed, because how do you control something that was never trying to cause chaos in the first place, that was just existing in a way that made everyone else's assumptions crumble? Subscribe before you miss the moment everything changes, because it's coming faster than you think. Leora met Ashen's gaze, and in that moment she understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Strength isn't about shouting or proving points. Strength is quiet, it's subtle, it's relentless, and when you finally step into it with someone you trust completely, it becomes absolutely unstoppable. Calvar rose slowly, deliberately, a movement meant to assert authority, to reclaim dominance through sheer physical presence. But Ashen's calm didn't waver, didn't bend, and the Alpha King's gesture suddenly looked less like command and more like compensation, less like power and more like fear wearing expensive clothes. And just like that, standing in that chamber with every eye burning into her, with the weight of her entire village's hope pressing against her ribs, Leora felt something dangerous and intoxicating bloom in her chest. Not victory exactly, because the fight wasn't over, but the possibility of victory, the understanding that maybe, just maybe, the people who'd always controlled everything were about to learn they'd been wrong about who actually had power here, and that realization was about to reshape everything.
Calvar's jaw tightened so hard you could hear his teeth grinding from across the chamber. And I need you to understand what was happening in his head right then, because it's the kind of moment that breaks people who've spent their entire lives believing they were untouchable. He was watching his authority, that invisible thing he'd worn like armor since the day he was crowned, crumble in real time. And the worst part wasn't that it was happening, it was that everyone could see it happening. Every noble, every guard, every witness in that room was watching the Alpha King realize he didn't actually control this moment, and maybe never had. The room held its breath in that specific way crowds do when they sense blood in the water, but aren't sure yet whose blood it is. And honestly, if you've ever been in a space where everyone is waiting for someone to crack, where the tension is so thick you could cut it with a dull knife, you know how exhausting that silence becomes, how it presses against your skull and makes your heart beat too loud in your own ears. Leora felt it immediately, that shift in the air like weather changing, and even the guards seemed uncertain now, shifting their weight, glancing at each other with expressions that said this wasn't in the training manual. Nobody told us what to do when the foundation starts shaking. And I swear, one of them actually took a half step backward, which in the language of royal protocol is basically screaming, "I want no part of whatever's about to happen." Ashen stood perfectly still, and here's what made it absolutely devastating. His stillness wasn't passive, it was active, it was a choice. The kind of calm that says, I could do so much more, but I don't need to, because my presence alone is enough. And that restraint somehow carried more weight than any display of raw power ever could, because it forced everyone to acknowledge that he was choosing not to escalate, which meant he had the power to escalate, which meant everything they thought they knew about control was suddenly questionable. Kalvar spoke, and his voice was lower now, tighter, stripped of that casual amusement he'd worn in the courtyard like expensive cologne. "Do you understand what this implies?" he said, and the question was directed at Leora, but really he was asking himself, asking the room, asking the universe, why his carefully ordered world was suddenly refusing to follow the script he'd spent decades perfecting. "Yes," Leora said, just that one word, and she realized immediately she didn't need to say more, didn't need to explain or justify or apologize, because the truth was standing right there beside her, making stone ripple like water. And sometimes the best response to a loaded question is just acknowledging that, yeah, you do understand. You understand exactly what's at stake, and you're not backing down. One noble stammered, this thin, high-pitched sound that would have been funny under different circumstances, but here just felt like watching someone's worldview shatter in real time. And another cleared their throat, trying to hide shaking hands behind elaborate sleeves. And Kelvar's eyes, sharp and commanding as ever, flickered downward for just a fraction of a second, just long enough to betray the storm happening inside his head. "Step closer," Kelvar demanded, except it came out more like a request he was pretending was an order, more like someone trying to reclaim authority by acting like they still had it. And Leora's pulse raced because she felt the weight of every expectation, every insult, every moment of being told she didn't belong pressed against her spine. But she wasn't afraid anymore, not really, because Ashen had shown her something fundamental about power. It doesn't come from fear, it comes from trust, from knowing you're not alone even when the whole world is staring at you like you're the problem. Have you ever watched someone realize they're not in control anymore? It's beautiful and terrible at the same time. The floor trembled lightly under Ashen's paws as he moved forward, obeying Kalvar's request, but on his own terms, at his own pace. And a ripple ran through the stone, so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't watching closely. But everyone in that room was watching closely. Everyone was paying attention now, and they felt it like a slap across the face, that impossible thing happening right in front of them. "Impossible," someone whispered, loud enough to make heads turn, quiet enough to feel dangerous, and the word hung in the air like an accusation nobody wanted to claim responsibility for. Then came the moment that changed everything, and I mean everything. Ashen tilted his head toward Leora, this casual, almost playful gesture, and with a movement that seemed simple but carried the weight of inevitability, the chamber responded. Stones shifted under their feet, not cracking or breaking, but flowing, adjusting, and torches flickered in patterns that hadn't existed seconds before, and shadows danced across walls in ways that seemed to follow Ashen's attention, like they were waiting for instructions. And Kalvar, the Alpha King, the man who commanded armies and bent nations to his will, found himself forced to step back. Not far, just one step, just enough to catch his balance. But that single step backward was louder than any trumpet, more significant than any decree, because everyone saw it. Everyone understood what it meant. The Alpha King had given ground. Kalvar's presence still filled the room, his authority still pressed outward like gravity, but for the first time it felt incomplete, felt like something that could be questioned. And if you've ever watched someone you thought was invincible suddenly look human, suddenly look uncertain, you know how disorienting that shift is, how it makes you question everything you thought was permanent. Leora's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close, because she remembered every sneer, every insult, every moment of being told she didn't belong, and suddenly it wasn't just her victory, it was the victory of everyone who'd ever been underestimated, mocked, dismissed as irrelevant. And that realization hit her so hard, she almost laughed, except her throat was too tight. The nobles shifted in their seats, uncomfortable now, trying to maintain composure while their entire understanding of hierarchy crumbled around them, and advisors whispered frantically, attempting to justify what they were seeing, trying to fit this impossible reality into frameworks that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate. Calvar's hands trembled slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and Leora was definitely looking for it, was cataloging every micro-expression, every crack in the facade, because these were the details that mattered, these tiny human moments when power couldn't hide behind titles anymore and had to stand on its actual merit. And here's the thing about authority that nobody talks about. It only works when everyone agrees to believe in it. And the moment that belief starts cracking, even slightly, even in just one person's mind, it spreads like a virus until suddenly the whole structure is questionable. Calvar spoke, and his voice was lower now, tighter, stripped of that casual amusement he'd worn in the courtyard like expensive cologne. "Do you understand what this implies?" he said, and the question was directed at Leora, but really he was asking himself, asking the room, asking the universe, why his carefully ordered world was suddenly refusing to follow the script he'd spent decades perfecting. "Yes," Leora said, just that one word, and she realized immediately she didn't need to say more, didn't need to explain or justify or apologize, because the truth was standing right there beside her, making stone ripple like water. And sometimes the best response to a loaded question is just acknowledging that, yeah, you do understand. You understand exactly what's at stake, and you're not backing down. One noble stammered, this thin, high-pitched sound that would have been funny under different circumstances, but here just felt like watching someone's worldview shatter in real time. And another cleared their throat, trying to hide shaking hands behind elaborate sleeves. And Calvar's eyes, sharp and commanding as ever, flickered downward for just a fraction of a second, just long enough to betray the storm happening inside his head. "Step closer," Kelvar demanded, except it came out more like a request he was pretending was an order, more like someone trying to reclaim authority by acting like they still had it. And Leora's pulse raced because she felt the weight of every expectation, every insult, every moment of being told she didn't belong pressed against her spine. But she wasn't afraid anymore, not really, because Ashen had shown her something fundamental about power. It doesn't come from fear, it comes from trust, from knowing you're not alone even when the whole world is staring at you like you're the problem. Have you ever watched someone realize they're not in control anymore? It's beautiful and terrible at the same time. The floor trembled lightly under Ashen's paws as he moved forward, obeying Calvar's request, but on his own terms, at his own pace. And a ripple ran through the stone, so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't watching closely. But everyone in that room was watching closely. Everyone was paying attention now, and they felt it like a slap across the face, that impossible thing happening right in front of them. "Impossible," someone whispered, loud enough to make heads turn, quiet enough to feel dangerous, and the word hung in the air like an accusation nobody wanted to claim responsibility for. Then came the moment that changed everything, and I mean everything. Ashen tilted his head toward Leora, this casual, almost playful gesture, and with a movement that seemed simple but carried the weight of inevitability, the chamber responded. Stone shifted under their feet, not cracking or breaking, but flowing, adjusting, and torches flickered in patterns that hadn't existed seconds before, and shadows danced across walls in ways that seemed to follow Ashen's attention, like they were waiting for instructions. And Calvar, the Alpha King, the man who commanded armies and bent nations to his will, found himself forced to step back. Not far, just one step, just enough to catch his balance. But that single step backward was louder than any trumpet, more significant than any decree, because everyone saw it. Everyone understood what it meant. The Alpha King had given ground. Calvar's presence still filled the room, his authority still pressed outward like gravity, but for the first time it felt incomplete, felt like something that could be questioned. And if you've ever watched someone you thought was invincible suddenly look human, suddenly look uncertain, you know how disorienting that shift is, how it makes you question everything you thought was permanent.
Leora's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close, because she remembered every sneer, every insult, every moment of being told she didn't belong. And suddenly, it wasn't just her victory. It was the victory of everyone who'd ever been underestimated, mocked, dismissed as irrelevant. And that realization hit her so hard, she almost laughed, except her throat was too tight. The nobles shifted in their seats, uncomfortable now, trying to maintain composure while their entire understanding of hierarchy crumbled around them, and advisors whispered frantically, attempting to justify what they were seeing, trying to fit this impossible reality into frameworks that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate. Kaelvar's hands trembled slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and Leora was definitely looking for it, was cataloging every micro-expression, every crack in the facade, because these were the details that mattered, these tiny human moments when power couldn't hide behind titles anymore and had to stand on its actual merit. And here's the thing about authority that nobody talks about. It only works when everyone agrees to believe in it. And the moment that belief starts cracking, even slightly, even in just one person's mind, it spreads like a virus until suddenly the whole structure is questionable. Kaelvar's voice broke the silence, quieter this time, and you could hear the shift in it, the move from command to something closer to negotiation. "Show me everything," he said, and those two words contained multitudes, admission that he didn't understand, acknowledgement that Ashen had more to reveal, and underneath it all, barely hidden, the request of someone who'd realized they weren't dictating terms anymore. Ashen's tail flicked once, casual and deliberate, and Leora knew with absolute certainty that the real challenge was about to begin, not a test of strength or magic or dominance, but a confrontation with truth so undeniable that even kings would have to acknowledge it or risk looking like fools. And in that chamber, with every eye watching and every breath held, the balance of power teetered on a knife's edge, ready to fall in whichever direction the next moment pushed it. Subscribe now, seriously, do it, because the people who don't, they're going to hear about what happens next from someone else, and that's the worst way to experience this. Here's what nobody tells you about watching someone powerful finally break. It doesn't happen with a bang. It happens with a slow crumbling that starts so small you almost miss it. And the moment you realize you're witnessing it, your heart starts pounding. Not because you're scared, but because you're watching history fold in on itself, and you absolutely know that nothing will be the same after this. The room went silent in a way that made Leora's ears ring, not the polite, staged silence of a court accustomed to spectacle, but a heavy, impossible-to-ignore quiet that pressed against her chest like a physical weight. And everyone, Kaelvar, the nobles, the advisors with their careful faces, was watching, waiting, and the air felt so thick she could barely breathe through it. Ashen stepped forward, and the floor beneath him shifted with that same subtle certainty she'd come to recognize, like the stone knew exactly where to hold him and where to bend, responding not to force but to presence. And Leora's pulse raced because this wasn't just a display anymore, this was the culmination of everything. Every humiliation she'd endured, every laugh she'd swallowed, every moment she'd been told she didn't matter. All of it compressing into this single impossible moment where the truth was about to shatter every lie they'd built their world on. Kaelvar's eyes narrowed, and she could see it happening in real time, that internal war between anger and disbelief and something else, something that looked uncomfortably like fear, and his thoughts were practically visible. This wasn't supposed to happen. I am supposed to be untouchable. I am supposed to command and have the world obey. But Ashen didn't roar, didn't threaten, didn't need to, because he moved with the quiet authority of inevitability, the kind of presence that bends the world without shattering it. And suddenly, everyone in that room realized something terrifying. Nothing they had done, no law, no threat, no carefully crafted sneer, could actually touch him. "Step aside," Kaelvar said, voice tight and carefully measured, trying to assert control, trying to salvage dominance, but even to him the words sounded hollow, sounded like someone giving orders to a storm and expecting it to obey. Leora stepped forward beside Ashen, her knees wanting to buckle, her hands shaking, not from fear but from the sheer intensity of the moment, feeling every eye in the room on her, every judgment, every doubt, every expectation compressed into a single stretching heartbeat that felt like it might never end. Have you ever stood at the edge of something so big you couldn't see where it ended? That's where Leora was, and honestly, that's where the entire court was too, because nobody knew what came next. Nobody had a script for this. She glanced at Ashen, and he gave her that faint tilt of his head, patient, knowing, and she drew in a slow breath that felt like pulling air through water, steadied herself on trembling legs, and took the first step into whatever history was about to become. Ashen raised his gaze toward Kael'var, and the air seemed to hum, low and vibrating like the world itself had leaned in to pay attention, and the shadows in the room bent around them, subtle at first, then stronger, like they were trying to frame the moment, to make sure everyone understood the weight of what was happening. Ashen didn't move aggressively, didn't bare teeth or growl, he simply was, and that presence alone forced the shift in perception, forced everyone to see what they'd been desperately trying not to acknowledge. Kael'var rose from his chair, the motion deliberate and slow, meant to reassert command through sheer physicality, but instead it revealed the truth he'd been hiding. He had miscalculated, had underestimated the bond between human and creature, between trust and power, had bet everything on intimidation and forgotten that real authority can't be performed, it has to be earned. Comment below if you've ever seen someone realize too late they were wrong, because that expression is something you never forget. And then it happened. So slowly it felt like watching a statue learn to move. Kael'var lowered himself, knees bending, body descending, not collapsing in defeat, but sinking in recognition of something far larger than his crown or his court or his carefully maintained image. And the collective gasp that rippled through the chamber was the sound of an entire worldview cracking, of assumptions shattering, of people watching power redistribute itself right in front of their eyes. Leora felt it like electricity through her bones, this tremor of disbelief mixed with vindication, mixed with terror, because a king kneeling wasn't just a gesture, it was a declaration that everything they thought was permanent was actually just temporary agreement, and agreements could be renegotiated. Ashen nudged her gently, this small, almost human gesture that somehow contained more weight than any speech. And in that moment, Leora understood the full depth of what had happened here. She hadn't just survived the trials, hadn't just proven Ashen deserved respect. She had fundamentally changed the rules, had shown the court and the nobles and every person who'd ever dismissed her that power isn't about titles or thrones or silver-threaded cloaks. It's about integrity, about trust, about the courage to stand beside someone when the whole world is telling you to step away. The advisors whispered frantically, trying to rationalize, trying to spin this into something they could control, trying to regain some foothold in a reality that had just shifted beneath them. But their words sounded hollow and desperate, like people shouting at an avalanche to please stop. Kael'var's eyes, still sharp even in his lowered position, held something different now. Not defeat exactly, but respect, recognition, the knowledge that he'd been confronted with undeniable truth and couldn't pretend otherwise, not without losing something more valuable than pride. Subscribe now, because this story isn't over, and what comes next will shock you. Leora exhaled slowly, feeling every trial, every whispered insult, every moment of doubt lift from her shoulders like weights she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten they were there. And as she and Ashen turned to leave the chamber, she allowed herself the smallest smile, not triumphant exactly, more like the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd been told their entire life they couldn't do something and just proved everyone wrong. The silence broke, not with applause because this wasn't a celebration, but with a realization that rippled through the room like a wave. The world had changed. A pet had revealed the limits of authority. Trust had proven stronger than fear. And Leora, quiet and unassuming and so easy to dismiss, had shown that power paired with integrity could reshape even the most unyielding of kingdoms. As they walked through those massive doors back into the corridor, torchlight catching Ashen's gray fur and making it shimmer almost silver, Leora heard fragments of conversations starting behind them, whispers that would become discussions, that would become stories, and she knew with absolute certainty that no matter what happened next, they would never forget this day, never forget the moment a common girl and a creature nobody understood forced a king to recognize that power comes in forms they hadn't bothered to acknowledge. But here's what kept her from feeling completely victorious, what made her glance back over her shoulder as the chamber doors began to close. Kael'var's expression as he rose again, that flash of something in his eyes that wasn't respect or fear, but calculation, the look of someone who'd lost a battle but was already planning the next war. And in the shadows at the edge of the room, she could swear she saw something move, something that hadn't been there before, watching with interest that felt distinctly unfriendly. Ashen's ears flicked back, catching the same wrongness she'd noticed, and as they walked deeper into the corridor, away from the judgment chamber and toward whatever came next, Leora understood that while they'd won this moment, proven their point, changed the game, there were forces in this kingdom older and more dangerous than even Kael'var, and those forces had just been reminded that power could shift, could change hands, could threaten the careful balance they'd maintained for generations, and threatened power, real, old sleeping power, doesn't stay sleeping forever. If you made it here, then it is a sign you are destined for this. Subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up so this would not be the last time you'd hear an interesting story from us. Thanks for watching.